The year was 1950. World War II was over, and the Cold War was gearing up. Now, there were many technological breakthroughs during World War II, and one of them was the introduction of jet fighter aircraft. Jets weren't invented during World War II, but they did finally see service during World War II, albeit very briefly. Germany had introduced the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter aircraft, which was pretty top-notch in its day, although its engines were a bit notorious for being a complete pain in the butt that required constant attention. Otherwise, they'd just stop working, so that's fun. However, over across the channel, the UK had also adapted the jet technology into a fighter aircraft known as the Gloster Meteor, which is my attempt at saying that in a really British way. I am so sorry, that accent is not going to work. I will not attempt that again. The Meteor did see brief military service during the end of World War II, but by the time it was introduced, the Luftwaffe was basically gone. Like, there really wasn't much of a reason to have another jet fighter in the air, because Germany didn't have anything to throw at it. And sadly, no, the Gloster Meteor and the Me-262 never did engage in aerial combat, which was actually a source of a bit of a disappointment by some RAF pilots. The Meteor is also sometimes credited as being the only jet fighter the Allies deployed during the war, and although many others were tested, this is technically true in terms of combat, although it is worth mentioning that over here we had the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star that did see some brief mission use, very limited, in Italy right before the end of the war. But the Meteor shouldn't be discounted in this regard based on the fact that it was actually deployed in combat situations, which the Shooting Star never got to do. Now, the Meteor is a pretty decent aircraft on its own, with plenty of interesting design attributes such as the engines being built into the wings as opposed to just hanging off of them. But it would only be in service a few years before it found itself a bit outclassed by more modern-style jet fighters. The second country started using aircraft with the swept-wing design that modern fighters are known for. The Meteor just couldn't cut it in terms of speed and maneuverability. But to its credit, it did stay in service for a while as a scout plane, and according to my sources, it is still technically being used as of 2018 as an ejection seat testbed. There are also at least 2 flying examples of the craft, one in the UK and one in Australia, which isn't too shabby for a plane that's pushing 80 years old at this point. But I bet you're wondering, alright, but how did this one hit a train? Was it on a mission? Was it trying to attack the train? This is the opposite of that story where the tank engine blew up the German fighter. Did the Meteor attack a German train and that train blew up and knocked it down? Nope, nothing like that. This is way stupider. On the 2nd of May, 1950, Flight Lieutenant William John Laidler of the RAF was on a flight just outside of the Deptford Air Base in Worcestershire, which I believe I'm saying correctly, but I'm sure I'll get corrected because, Lord knows I always am. Now, the Deptford Air Base isn't actually RAF anymore. It was decommissioned as it was too small for the large V bombers that the RAF was doing flight trials with. So they moved over to RAF Pershore, which I am probably saying wrong too. Maybe Pershore, Pearshore. Lieutenant William was flying a Gloster Meteor, like I said, but this was an F Mark IV, so it was an updated version of the plane. But when the Deptford Airfield was active, there was actually a railroad track that passed very close to the runway. This wouldn't be super unusual, as we previously established, railroads are everywhere in the UK and they're rather condensed, so it's not unreasonable to expect that one would pass nearby an airbase. The problem was, as Lieutenant William brought in his Gloster Meteor for a landing, he brought it in just a little bit low. At the same time, purely by coincidence, a passenger train was passing by on the line near the landing strip. Lieutenant William was so low that he actually struck the cab of the locomotive pulling the train. Now, it was a glancing blow, very minor. Had he been any lower, he may have crashed, but fortunately that did not happen. He did do minor damage to the undercarriage and his landing gear. This necessitated a belly landing, which he actually managed to pull off without a problem, so he was okay, and the Meteor was likely repaired. But I bet you're wondering what happened to the train. Well, normally I would tell you details about the locomotive in question in this type of situation. I already talked about the plane, but unfortunately, I've been all over this story and found every source I possibly can muster, from old newspaper clippings to the actual report filed by the RAF, and at no point does anybody mention exactly what type of locomotive was pulling the train that day. Based off of additional information regarding history, I can cross-examine some sources and take an educated guess for you. Now, this was after 1948, so British Rail had already taken over all the railroads, but it was so soon that they hadn't gotten around to actually replacing most of the rolling stock. So assuming they were still using what the original railway would have had, and this stretch of line used to belong to the Great Western Railway based on my sources, I could hazard a guess that it was probably, and I want to stress probably, because I do not know for sure, but it was probably a GWR 4900 class, which is a 460 missed traffic steam locomotive. Pretty decent steam engines, actually. Quite nice. But this is all me just gathering as much information as I can and making a radical assumption purely on the basis of what they would have had for such a train, what year it was, and what is the likely scenario. But it could have been a few different locomotives. This is just one of the more likely ones. The point is, I do not know what locomotive was struck by the plane that day. What I do know is that it suffered very minor damage, and in fact continued on as if nothing had really happened as far as the engine was concerned. It actually finished its entire run that day, likely being taken to the shop for minor repairs later. The boiler, firebox, and everything mechanical was totally fine. The cab had just suffered a minor dent. The only casualty of the situation, beyond the damage to the Meteor itself, was the engineer of the locomotive that day, who apparently suffered severe shock and actually had to be hospitalized from the incident, and he was relieved at the following station. Why did he freak out so bad? Well, I have a couple guesses here. For one, it was 1950, and whether or not he was in the military or not, the UK public had suffered a ton of bombing runs less than a decade prior. Luftwaffe had done a ton of different bombing operations over the UK, both civilian and military. So this guy probably knew what it was like to hear a plane fly very low, so he may have suffered some kind of PTSD reaction to the situation. And if he was in the military, it could have been even worse, since, well, I mean, he was in the military. It was World War II. Things were really bad out there. The point is, he didn't react well. But upon going to the hospital, he was alright, and returned to his job not long after. That was definitely a tale. But hey, maybe we should stop letting planes touch trains, like, ever. One of these two things is going to win, generally, and it's not going to be the plane. Especially if they're, you know, head-to-head, like, ramming each other. That's all I'm trying to say. You know, your state-of-the-art jet fighter just grazed a locomotive and nearly crashed. Aircraft generally aren't designed for ramming speed, is what I'm trying to say. Just be more careful, guys. Just look out, alright? Stop, look, and listen. Even if you're in the sky, stop, look, and listen. Let's go with that. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.